Hey, this is Albion, Land of Fairy. This is an Aries magazine from SPI. I don't have the cover with me. All my old Aries are at my mom's basement, actually. Someday I may have them back. Okay, so this is, I think, from the first year of the magazine. It didn't last very long, but it had some really cool games. And this is one of the more promising ones in a lot of ways. We'll take a look at it. It has its flaws. What it is essentially a fantasy-based, straight-up hex encounter war game with, some kind of feeling of ancients, but it's got magic, enchantment, stuff like that in it. And it's actually one of the better fantasy war games out there. Maybe the best straight up war game. The only thing that I'd compare it to that I'm familiar with is Avalon Hill's Dark Emperor, which I have to find in my... There, I got it there. Well, you could also probably compare it to War of the Ring and Swords of Sorcery there. And maybe Dragon Pass. But it uses fairly standard feeling core rules, similar somewhat to maybe Richard Berg's Druid that came a little later for an Ancients design. Anyway, let's take a look at what we have with the game before we get into the rules. I'm probably not going to go over all of the rules. You have a fairly rich, basically, there's a catalog of magic items and character abilities and everything. And if you don't know them, you can't play the game particularly well, but most people probably wouldn't play the game enough to really get to know them. And that's going to be one of the issues that I have with it. You have a fairly rich map of Britain, or the British Isles, and with a decent amount of different terrains available in each hex. We'll see how that's handled, including things like fortifications for the different races. This is going to be a war that's primarily between the fairy and the trolls, and you can make whatever racial decisions you want to make that they or insinuations that you want about what the decisions they made. Culturally, the Scots were made into trolls. Of course, this is the game is somewhat based on the old Celtic myths, and the characters from it are Celtic characters. They've been placed on Britain in locations which don't really correspond with the stories too much. Those stories are mainly Welsh, and probably the entire game should be centered on Wales, but we'll leave that alone for now. Although some of the Irish stuff is very Irish in nature, Dagda and Bridget and such not. Most of the characters I recognize from the Celtic mythos. Some of them I'm not so sure may have been kind of fudge. So what you've got is basically Elvish in the center, British territories and Wales. You got gnomes over in Cornwall. Humans over here on the coastal area who have been invading the island. They're called the Mundanes. And another little group up here at the borders. They're going to be allied with the trolls. All of Scotland is trollish. And then Ireland is going to be split fairly closely along the religious and colonization lines again, with the sort of more English east being aligned as Elvish and the west being aligned as Trollish. Within that you have several kingdoms though, and in particular the game is going to start with the trolls attacking Albion itself, which is sort of the central Midlands area, maybe a little further south there. They can acquire allies from Wales, Cornwall with the gnomes, and then the Irish elven territories as well. The reason that this was a good time to attack is that Oberon the Short is, it's a little Shakespearean there, right? is away on an expedition, and that's assigned here, and it's believed that this is a good time to hit Albion. We have a lot of tracks here. So all that terrain on the map, well, it's all going to be covered in one big terrain chart. And that terrain chart is going to have movement rates for all the different races. Let's see. Men, gnomes, trolls, and elves. And likewise, they have a battle effect of the different terrain, and then an effect on the combat itself. Or on attrition or some other aspects. We'll look at the counters in a little bit, but there are going to be personalities in this game, leaders, if you will, and they have different ranks and symbols on them that help identify their different capabilities in it. There's going to be magic items you can find, and use this discovery table if you're in one of the correct locations to find them. They're on the map. The core combat system, well, we'll get to that in a moment. The activation table, each turn, each player gets to roll to try to activate their allies. And the trolls only have one inactive ally, the Worm of Mousestraur, who's up here on top of his treasure. And he's a sea serpent type thing. And then the elves have a whole bunch, or Albion has a whole bunch of potential allies, some magical characters, powerful magicians. Oberon's expedition has a chance of coming in. And then all the other kingdoms can be activated. Now it's possible the trolls could just invade them, and that probably will happen actually, at least in Ireland, where the trolls don't really have a good task in hand unless they attack one of the two kingdoms. I favor Leinster because it's a little weaker. All right, the combat charts, well, before we get to them, the attrition. This is going to relate to the combat charts. Basically, when you make an attrition die roll, you're going to be rolling 2 dice on here to get a letter. That letter is going to reflect to the casualty table, and you compare the strength of the force to the combat result coming from the attrition table. The combat results table itself also uses the casualty table, and it's going to be a straight odds chart, and this is going to be used, this is kind of strange, for all types of combat. Now, some of the combat's character combat, and it gets especially weird when there's magical combat involved, but essentially you just calculate an odds ratio, you roll a pair of dice, and you get results pertaining to the attacker and the defender. Kind of reminds you of the old War of the Ring game in that way, and it really is, some of the inspiration for this is very clearly taken from that game. All right, let's take a look at the sequence of play and try to run through things a little bit more quickly. Oh, we have ships. So ships with this little sail marker are going to be bad sailors. What about the values on the units? Yeah, we should talk about that. So, let's see. We'll look at them as they go forward. So first is regular army pieces, which are going to have a movement allowance up here, a combat strength here, a unit type, which is important in terms of determining the racial composition of it for the terrain. We have a bunch of breakdown pieces, not a particularly useful assortment. In some cases, for example, Albion has a bunch of 2-point strength. I'm sorry, that's going to end. Albion has a bunch of 2-point strength point units and nothing else. I think the assumption is in normal play, Albion is going to get pretty hosed pretty quickly. Other things like the gnomes have a humongous assortment of different counters, and you often feel like, geez, I wish I had more of the others. You can always exchange things in and out, though you can make change with them as you like. And I don't think you're limited by the counter mix for those, because basically you have a certain starting strength point, and that's just going to go down. You're not going to have any production or anything like that in this, which always disappointed me early on. Ships have a movement allowance on them and a combat strength, and then they have a flip side, which is going to be a reduced value if they're damaged. They might have this bad sailor symbol, which will affect attrition effects. People. Okay, The people in the game have a number of different symbols on them, which we should probably go through, but I'm going to go through the numbers first. You have their name, of course, up here. You have their movement allowance, and they have two sides in general. An escorted side, in which case they have a combat strength point with them, and an unescorted side. And they can just drop that combat strength point off if they wish and pick another one up of their nationality when it's convenient to them. They have a combat strength, which is usually going to be sort of their personal combat ability. A magic strength, which gets affected by the turn of the game. You're going to add that magic strength to the mana level on the turn of the game, which can have some really weird effects where sometimes weaker magicians are really not that weak because they get such a boost from the overall mana present. And that can create some kind of weird situations that you just don't feel like. When we see magic combat happen, you'll see where this kind of disturbs me. They also have a command rating, possibly, which is going to be their ability to influence combat and some movement capabilities, attrition, and the like. Okay, we have a whole bunch of different symbols on here. The first type of symbol, the first class, is up here. It's the command rating. And you have different levels, captain, marshal, and king. And that's basically what kind of units they can lead. A captain can only lead units of his own country, a marshal of his own race. A king can lead any units aligned with him. The highest ranked person in the space is going to be in command for battle. But if you have a tie, you have a choice. And then special modifiers, enchanter or hero. Okay, the enchanter is very simple. That's someone who can actually cast magic beyond just having a magical ability. So let's look for an example. I have one right here, but it's upside down. So this guy is not an enchanter, but he has a 3 magic rating, which means he can participate in magical combat, and his magic can affect land combat. However, we have someone like Magog here, who's an enchanter, who actually has, I think, a lower magical strength, but is an enchanter, which means he's going to be allowed to cast spells that have an effect beyond just combat and attrition and some other effects. Beyond just the military units. You also have the hero. The hero is a special type of character. You won't ever have a hero enchanter. Here's an example of one. The hero is so good at combat that his combat strength counts as actual units in a battle. So he's got a very, very powerful ability to affect a battle. And if he's in melee combat or challenge combat, his strength will be doubled to reflect that tremendous bonus that he has. A whole bunch of, well, we got these rune counters. When you destroy somebody's fortresses, you can turn them into runes, and that's worth victory points to do. They're each backfitted with something else. This is an enchantment counter, which indicates that the character under it is using an enchantment for that turn and can't do much else. A refit counter, which is used on ships. When they're damaged, you can bring them back up to strength. And these are magical vortices, which I believe only work in the water, but I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go through the spell book. And that's one of the most expensive aspects of this game. The rules themselves are not that complicated, but interpreting all the different magical items, what to find, what to go look for, and all that becomes as complex as, say, a game of Freedom in the Galaxy, except that everything's known and on the board, so you're at a real disadvantage if you don't know where things are, and I don't know where things are, so I'm at a real disadvantage against myself, I guess. Sequence of play, I don't have that written out separately. Wonder why. I think my ex wrote this one out, but I don't. Okay, so let's go through this. First, you hit a weather segment where you just look up the weather for the game turn. There are turns where it's raining over here on the end of the track, and that means that there's rain everywhere on the map. Otherwise, the weather is going to be clear by default, but Magic can turn it to either rain or snow, and that could be either a limited localized effect or across the whole board. Then you write down secretly your enchantments. This is kind of like Barbarian Kings, where each person that you have who's in a location that can cast an enchantment, which I believe are these hexes with the enchantment symbol, can secretly write down that they're casting a certain spell. They have a range based on their current mana. The current mana is going to be the mana for the turn added to their base mana that's on their counter, the center number there. Okay. They have a base chance of succeeding in casting the spell equal to the current mana. So they'll roll 2 dice and try to get equal to or under that. Anyway, these are all secretly plotted, and then you check to see if they're cast. You get an enchantment marker on the character if they cast something, whether they succeed or not, and that'll indicate they can't do anything. Then we go to an attrition segment. This is going to be a joint attrition segment, and you suffer attrition for a number of things. It's probably listed here by the different, So if you're a fairy in a mundane aspected hex, a yellow backed hex, you're going to suffer attrition. Likewise, if you're a human in an enchanted hex, which is the kind of the green backed stuff, which the fairies like to live in, you'll suffer attrition. Most notably, and if you're in a pink area, no matter what you are, you're going to suffer attrition because that's wild magic. Most notably, what you're going to be seeing, though, is that the gnomes and the trolls are pretty much immune to that kind of magical attrition. They're okay living anywhere. Let's see. Otherwise, if you've got units out of command that aren't in a fortress, if you've got ships in bad weather, bad sailing ships in bad weather, these things are going to cause you to roll on the attrition table. And there you just basically roll here. You might take a penalty on that. So for example, I don't think I've got it. I don't think it's written here. Okay. But for example, there's a +3 penalty, I think it is, for being in the wrong magic type of area. So like humans in fairy magic, enchanted hexes. And there's a +5 penalty for being in wild magic, which is going to significantly affect how many pieces you lose. The pieces you lose will also be all affected by how big your force is. So a larger force is going to take a larger amount of raw losses, and that all makes sense for attrition. When we get to combat, I've got some gripes about that. I've never really been sure about combat results tables that cause greater losses to bigger forces. Those cause you to do some kind of weird manipulations of your forces, and I never quite get a grasp on what I should be doing in those. So both players take attrition here. Then we go to the Fomorian or Trollish player, and then the Fairy player turn. And what they're going to be doing is, first, they get to heal characters. They get to refit their ships that they've already started refitting and move some others under refit. And then they're also eligible to roll a die to try to heal characters automatically. Now, the other kind of healing is if you're in certain locations or with certain magic available, you can just automatically heal characters a certain amount, dependent on each. Then the phasing player rolls on the activation table for each power that they have not yet activated and see if they come into play. Then you're going to be allowed to move. And movement in general is going to be based on the movement effects chart, which is different for each race, depending on the type of terrain you go into. You pay, because there's multi-terrain hexes. I'm trying to remember what you have to pay for that. I think you get to choose the terrain you're moving through when you're moving, but there are some restrictions. The dike you must always pay the cost for. Areas that aren't completely clear but have some terrain in them, you have to pay one of the terrain types. You can't just pay it as if it's clear terrain. Some of them, they have to show you the underlying color for the magical color, so that's kind of not part of it. You've got these trails running through here. You got Elvish roads here, and they all have their own terrain value for movement. So let me see if I can find the Elvish road. I'm not seeing it. Here's the trail. That has a movement of 1. Notably, those don't negate the cost of moving over the hex sides, though. They make the hex cost a certain amount, but the hex side has to still be paid in addition to that. So if you're going through a mountain pass, you have to pay the mountain pass cost as well. I think that's the primary effect of that, or if you're crossing a river. I'm not seeing those Elvish roads. Oh, here they are, Ferry Road. They have a high cost for everyone who's not an elf, or a higher cost. But if you have elves with them, that cost goes down to the same as trails do. The movement point costs for the movement point values for the units is actually quite high. If you look, your average unit here, say 14 movement points for a ferry unit. Humans have 12. Now, leaders alone have more movement points available to them, but if they have forces attached to them, they're going to have less movement points total, the same as they would if they were those forces. You have a cost to overrun. If you enter a hex with the other player's units, you can choose to overrun combat, and you'll handle combat immediately. You only get 1 round. If you don't wipe them out, you stop there. And it costs you a certain amount of movement points, whether you succeed or not. So you've got to have the extra movement points to force that attack. Let's keep going. At this point, you're allowed to also spend movement points to conduct artifact searches. And what you're going to do there is you go to the hex that has the proper artifact in it, and you roll a couple of dice. You get a modification to that. I don't remember what it is. I think it's like magic value or something. And you might be able to find something in there, but you might also take a loss. Oh, I'm sorry. The C value here is the loss. That's the number of combat strength points you're going to lose for trying to look for stuff there if you have troops with you. If you don't have troops, you're okay. The number is the number of the item that you find, and those are going to be magic items that are in the catalog. When you take casualties on a character, there's going to be a chart kind of like in War of the Ring, and you mark them off, and your physical strength goes down, your combat strength goes down by each loss that you take. And those, I think, actually exactly match the combat strength, so that's not really an issue. We talked a little bit about attrition, probably enough to handle it. Enough about recovery and refit. Like I said, there's specific places where you can recover. Activation. I think enough about movement. There's a few special kinds of movement. Ships can pick up units and move around with them. The units can't move in the same turn that they're picked up. It costs the ship movement points. The ships have big movement allowances, like 30. This is not a particularly fast ship, but that just gives you an idea of what we're talking. You can teleport if you've got a... Does it have to be an enchanter? No. Any person with magical ability who's in a place of power can teleport to another place of power, basically for 1 movement point. But he can pay more to bring other people through, and he can bring their escorts through. But he can't bring army units that aren't escorting them through. And it's all going to cost more movement points. He basically makes a roll. If he fails, he can keep making more rolls, expending movement points to try to open up that gate that he's going to push through there. I haven't seen a lot of that, but that's one way to get between the 2 continents, or the islands, that I probably haven't thought enough about or played enough with. Mainly because both islands end up kind of, both England and Ireland end up kind of stalemating. Or Britain and Ireland, for those who want to be precise. If your units are not under a leader that they can command them, they're going to suffer in combat. They're going to have half effectiveness in combat. They're also going to take attrition if they're outside. Now, this is a weird combination. So the overall leader has to be able to command the entire stack in order to conduct combat. But as long as there's a leader with the stack, the way movement works, you can split things up as you like and move one little piece at a time or something. You can stop a unit in the midst of movement and move another unit, and then go back to the original one, spending the rest of its movement points. So it's a very, very permissive movement system compared to what you might be used to in most games. That doesn't really have a whole hell of a lot of effect, except that in overruns you have to have your whole stack together when you move in. So you can kind of arrange that during it. But because of the fact that you can move whoever you like when you like, you can kind of define your stacks as being commanded, as being separate stacks commanded by different people. So for attrition, as long as you have a leader in the space, you're okay. A leader who can command the troops in the space, you're okay for attrition purposes. But if you have a stack that does not have a leader and he's out of a fortress, he will suffer attrition during that step. Okay, if you're in the same space as another player, you're allowed to declare combat. There are 5 different types of combat in this game, and they all use the same general principle. Let me go through the 5 different types. So you got your regular land battles, you've got naval engagements, you've got melees, which are when groups of people run into each other without troops. That doesn't happen, but there's rules for it anyway. And then you've got 2 challenge combats, trial by combat and magical trials, magical challenge combat. And you can have almost all of these in the same hex at the same time. So if you have a naval or land engagement, either side, well, if 2 people are in the same space, either side can declare there's going to be attack. The attacker suffers a penalty in terms of being affected by certain terrain effects that run down here. So for example, intrinsic defense strength of 1. No, that's not what I mean. Let's look for something that's going to give a doubling. Yeah, I don't see anything that gives a combat effect directly. So the base combat effect is just going to be the battle effect on here, which is half, doubling, tripling, whatever, based on how well you like that particular terrain. So if we look at something simple like woods, elves are doubled in the woods. That doesn't matter if they're attacking or defending. So that's pretty cool for them. Now, the initial defender gets to choose the terrain, and then it stays the same for the battle, and battles will go multiple rounds. Once you start a declaration of combat, we're talking mainly land combat here, but the other types will go kind of similarly. Once you start a declaration of combat, then you have the opportunity to issue challenges, both physical and mental, or combat and magical combat. There is a penalty to the combat die roll for refusing to fight a challenge combat. So you may want to do that, but there's a penalty to losing a character in a trial by combat. You add up the strength of the units involved, multiplied by the terrain. You add in the strength of all the characters who are heroic, their physical combat strength. You add the magical strengths of all the characters present, and then you come up with a ratio, and those magical strengths can be a huge effect on this ratio. And then you'll roll a pair of dice on that and see what happens. Modified by primarily whether or not you did the challenge combat, I believe. Naval combat works kind of the same way. Troops on board the ship, I'm not sure if they count or not. I found one place where it says they don't and one place where it says they do. I think they do, given the era that it is. But it may be I'm misreading it and it's limited. Maybe it's only like personal escort counts or something. Anyway, naval combat works pretty much the same way. You can have challenge combat in it, etc. Let's go to the challenge combats. Challenge combats are going to be one character against one character. They face off and they compare their values and come up with an odds just like. Now, results in combat for either type. The left side is the effect to the army. The right side is the effect to characters. And you'll see that the left side is the effect. it to the attacker, the right side's the effect to the defender. Over here, the loss table, left side's going to be to armies, right side is to characters, and you'll see obviously armies take a lot more hits as the strength goes up, but characters also take more hits. If it's a land or naval combat, those hits just get assigned to the characters who are presumed to be involved in the battle. If there's a little 1 next to a loss, that means that all the hits have to be taken on one character until that character dies, and then you can assign them to other characters at will. Naval losses will also be the right-hand side, the character loss side of things, which is good because there aren't very many naval units, and they'd very quickly disappear if they took like the kind of losses based on the strength alone, because they actually have some strength. This has 3 strength points, but it only counts as it'll be taking the right hand side losses. And the same factors go in with character combat. If you're doing a melee, or more likely at this point challenge combat, you worry about the strength of the character. So a very strong character might actually take more hits than a weaker character, and that's something you have to kind of keep in mind, I guess. And I'm having trouble with my battery here. No big shock, but let's see. I'm bumping things. Yep. Yep, there goes the wire. Oh, I hate to pause the video. There we go. Power back. Because that takes more effort on YouTube. I have to wait longer to load it to have YouTube process the video. There it goes again. Fuck. Okay. We'll see if we can get enough juice in to finish this. All right. So what I didn't go through was melee combat at all. Melee combat is basically all the characters involved in are in a hex, and this might happen when you're searching for magic items. Somebody might be searching and you say, well, I can't bring armies into that hex, but I could throw a bunch of characters in there to fight. In which case it might happen every now and then. Melee combat is just like army combat. It's just like the army challenge combat, except that you end up including all your characters in the fight. Now, if you have characters being challenged, perhaps is the word, by a bunch of by an army unit, the characters will automatically die if they don't get away. They can get away by using evasion, however. And if they use evasion, let's see, I think they can use... Yeah, each player's roll is modified by either the combat rating, the command rating, I'm sorry, or the current magic strength of one friendly person in the hex as to how well they can kind of hide or search. There it goes again. Yep, should buy myself a new camera. Ah, shit. Crap. Okay. There are also magic items in the game. Not just these that are here, but some characters have a magic item on them. So here are magic items that are called heirloom items. Their kingdom can control them, and basically the player can't make them leave that kingdom is how I rule it, but it's not without everybody from that kingdom kind of being ineligible or by being dead or something to have them. And this is just not working. Okay. We also have character items, shit, there it goes again, which are associated with that particular character, and that character will have them on his body at all times until he's killed, at which point they become free game for anyone. When you fight in a battle, you might lose magic items. God damn it. Yeah. Son of a bitch. Okay. Well, we'll try to finish this quickly before my battery runs out. Okay. Victory conditions are one of the key issues to this game. You get points for killing the enemy's combat strength points, for destroying fortresses, that's 10 points each, and for killing people are 5 points each, and ships as well. The person with the most victory points wins the Grand Fairy Twilight scenario, which is the whole war. There's a shorter Albion Alone scenario, which basically covers a shorter period of the game. Okay, we're almost out of energy here. And I've never played that. I've only played the big one. The problem with the big one is there's a proviso in it. If both players combined add up to more than 400 victory, the shorter one, the trolls have they have to get like triple the victory point value that the elves have. The longer one, you just have to get higher than your opponent. But if the combined values of the two victory point values are 400 or higher, both players lose. Now, I'm going to try to play this with that idea that I take from the semi-co-ops like Republic of Rome. Somewhere over here. So focused on my damn camera, which is out of energy again, that I can't do what I like to do. Piece of crap. Okay. It was a fine camera. It's just things shouldn't break within a year, you know, or 2 years, or whatever I've had this one for. All right. So if you exceed that 400 victory point total between the two players, both players are going to lose, which I'm going to take as a worse result than not winning the game. The reason for that is the game will almost invariably end up at that 400 if one person thinks he can push it back over into the, well, I'm not winning, so you're not going to win either, right? So if I take that 400 victory points limit as a worse thing than simply losing the war, then I may be more careful. And we may see a truce here. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that historically, if you want to say this can be done, talked about historically in any sense, obviously the humans, the mundanes, did win, which is what the result of the 400 victory point, exceeding the 400 victory points is. But that's a foregone conclusion, and it's a very uninteresting game. It will always end up in a draw if you take a look at both players losing as being a draw, as opposed to being a worse condition than one player winning and the other player simply not winning. So, in the interest of keeping the game interesting rather than any kind of historical accuracy in a fantasy game, okay. We have a summary of all the different characters here, and this is kind of important. You have to be familiar with all of these. For example, you have to know, let's see, not all of them have something key to them, but you have to know something like Kate, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I don't know it. Calic, the witch Calic. When she dies, she flips over and becomes Calic's waif, another character. And we also have the Kate Sith, which appears when Corrin the Shaper dies. Very similar. Then we also have the list of all the different enchantments, which you have to kind of know to play the game properly, and I, of course, do not. One of them I do know, the enchantment of Far Calling. I'll look over these and go over them as I play, but I'm not going to pre-learn all that crap, you know? That's not my style of gaming. I don't want to do that, and what it ends up being is the game's never quite as satisfying as maybe it could be. Maybe it could be a really great competitive game, except for the victory conditions, if players really memorized all these things. And the magic item summary is similar, and there's also places of power. Now, these lists are quite large. Not everything in them is at all valuable to you. And had they come up with these are the things you actually want to know, and this is mostly historical comment, and then repeat them in the historical commentary, but mainly have a historical commentary section as well as a player aid that has the few or many, because there are a fair amount, important things reflected in them. Now, some obviously are important. The enchantments, every single one of those has a game effect. The magic items, every single one has a game effect. But not all the people nor all the places of power have a game effect, and there's a lot of detail on those. About the magazine itself, because I just want to chime in a little bit about it, I remember this one. I may be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure this was the one that turned me on to knowing about the old straight track, which, if you're a Jethro Tull fan and you don't know about the book, you may recognize the words there anyway from Songs from the Wood. But that was the theory of the ley lines and how all the different places of power are connected by it. And that got me really excited, and I actually had to track that book down. It took me a couple decades before I actually found the book at a used bookstore and bought it for my wife at that time. And she was very excited about it. I was too. It ended up a little dry, but it was interesting because, I don't know, I'm always interested in these kind of alternative and new wavy type theories. And this is one from, I think, the 20s. These kind of things are always chiming up. Anyway, it's an interesting game. It's one that's never met my expectations, but we'll give it a shot to play it. And, I mean, I always have some fun with it, so can't complain too much. Sending it up.